Good evening. Once again, I want to say welcome to everyone. I hope that you've had a good day. And it's windy and cold outside, but looking out the window, we see God's beauty, His creation, and the life that He provides us to show us exactly how powerful He is. And regardless of what the weather feels like, it's always a great day for we can come together to worship the Lord in the way that He has commanded us to. Hopefully, you've had a great day and it's been kind to you. I went home and worked on my lesson to get it finalized and watched Team USA win that gold medal. All right, so I hope you've had a great day. Tonight we're going to continue what we've been doing for the last few Sunday nights. And that I told you guys back in January that I was kind of planning on splitting up the next 2 or 3 or 4 months, and that doing some parables or a series of the parables. And then I was looking at possibly doing a series on different translations of the Bible. And I kind of adjusted that a little bit to where we're going to hold off on the second idea and probably going to do it maybe in a 2-part lesson, Lord willing, in the coming future. I haven't been able to quite do everything I wanted to in regards to that as of now. And we got so many parables and so many great lessons from parables that I want to just focus on that for the next month or so. So tonight we're going to continue to talk about different parables of the Bible. And tonight we're looking at the parable of the persistent widow. Turn with me, if you will, to Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18. Curtis read from a part of this just a minute ago. I want to go back and look at the whole thing here. And then again, as far as I know, Luke is the only source of this parable. And this is a parable that, again, is fairly simple to understand. Starting with verse 1, rather, it says, "Now Jesus was telling them a parable to show that all times they ought to pray and not to lose heart, saying, in a certain city there was a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. There was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him, saying, 'Give me legal protection for my opponent.' For a while he was unwilling, but afterwards he said to himself, 'Even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection. Otherwise, by continually coming, she will wear me out.' And the Lord said, 'Hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now will not God bring about justice for his elect who cry to him day and night? And will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?'" Again, this is a very short parable, and one that we can look at and understand fairly easily. Looking at the first part of this, it says that there was a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. So this is a judge here that in regards to being faithful to God or in regards to being faithful, whether it was a Jew, Christianity hadn't begun yet. But this is a man who obviously did not fear God, had no respect for man whatsoever. So we can figure that this is probably a judge that only looked out for himself, which we see many times throughout history. And that's important because as we look at verse 3, it says, "There was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him, saying, 'Give me legal protection from my opponent.' For a while he was unwilling, but afterward he said to himself, 'Even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection.'" So you have a woman here, a widow, who goes to this judge, who says, "I need protection." And he's not going to give it to her. But she goes back, apparently time and time and time again, and to the point to where he finally says, "Okay, fine, I'll do it." Not of the goodness of his heart, not because he is convinced in some way, because all of a sudden he fears God or her, but rather she's just bothering him. And so to get her to go away, he's going to offer her legal protection. He says here in verse 4 and 5, "Even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection. Otherwise, by continually coming, she will wear me out." She's worn him out. She's worn out his will. And that first of all, he was going to deny it, and apparently denied it several times until she kept going back and kept going back and kept going back. So what's the purpose of this parable? We see here this man gives in because this widow won't stop. Jesus says in verse 6, it says, "Hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now will not God bring about justice for his elect who cry to him day and night? And will he delay long over them?" Again, we look at a parable here where, again, God is going to be the same way. And if we keep going back to God and coming back to God, repenting to God, being faithful to God, then again, God's going to be there for us. So what we see here in this parable is this persistent widow is that she never stopped, and as a result of that, she was able to get what she needed. Now, this wasn't necessarily a case where someone keeps bugging somebody and just to get what I want. But again, Jesus is using this parable for a reason, for a purpose. And comparing this in regards to what we see with God. And that if we're persistent with God, again, we have to make sure that we're being faithful to Him and not just keep bothering Him just to bother Him, but make sure that we actually do what He tells us to. And if we're persistent in our faith and if we're persistent in our service to Him, then again, we see the same mercy coming from God. And regardless of whether or not this man is no respecter of person, we do see maybe a little bit of mercy out of him, in that she keeps coming, and he wants her to leave him alone. But at the same time, I see God here, where if we're persistent with Him, then again, we're going to see Him having mercy over us. In verse 8, I tell you that He will bring about justice for them quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will He find faith on the earth? So again, we're looking at the idea of faith. We're looking at the idea of being persistent. We're looking at the idea of not giving up. I'm not going to read through this, but as we look at the next story here, we look at the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. And again, we're looking at someone who just has a humble attitude versus someone who is arrogant. So as we go back and look at this parable here, there are three main points that we're going to get from this tonight. And looking at the persistence that we have to make sure that we have in regards to get that good favor from God. First of all, we have to make sure that we are persistent in prayer. We have to make sure that we pray to God on a continuous basis. Going back to our parable here in verse 1, it says Jesus was telling the parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not become discouraged. You see, verse 1 here tells a little bit of a story about what's going on here and why Jesus is telling this parable. And that his men were discouraged. His disciples had been discouraged. They had been going from city to city, and there were times where they had success. There were times where they had a lot of pushback. And Jesus says here, don't get discouraged. And then he goes into this parable of this persistent woman. And again, she was doing good. If they do good, then again, they will see the right favor. 1 John chapter 5, verse 14 says, this is the confidence which we have before Him, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. And if we know that He hears us in whatever we ask, we know that we have the request which we have asked from Him. You see, we have to be persistent in regards to our prayer to God. I think that a lot of people have the mindset in that I pray to God about something and it doesn't happen. God doesn't hear my prayers, or God doesn't care about what I'm asking for, or God has forgotten. We see that first and foremost, God is going to answer prayers in His own time. And that even when God hears them, He's going to answer them according to His will. But that doesn't mean that we just give up. Have to make sure that we continually pray. Just as it says here in 1 John, says that we know that He hears us in whatever we ask, and we know that we have the request which we have asked from Him, if we are persistent. It's not that we just pray once and then let the pieces fall where they may. We have to keep praying. There's a reason that we have an opening prayer and a closing prayer for each service. There's a reason that we should be praying all day, every day, morning, noon, night, and that we're persistent in our prayers to God. Because we need to make sure that God hears us, God understands us, and again, understanding the patience that we need to have and looking for that response from God. But again, we're told here that if we ask anything according to His will, then He hears us. And we have to be persistent in that belief and in that faith. Have you ever prayed for something and it didn't happen? You ever prayed to God for something, whether it's someone to get better from a sickness or illness, or maybe if there's a certain situation you're going through? And maybe you didn't get the answer that you were looking for immediately, or maybe you just didn't get that answer at all. Maybe someone is sick, we pray for them to get better, and they end up passing from this earth. Does that mean that God doesn't hear us? Does it mean that God doesn't care? And the answer to both those questions are no. We know that God hears us regardless, and again, we have to be persistent. Sometimes we may not always get the answer that we're looking for. But again, be persistent in that prayer nonetheless. How many times have we heard of stories and situations of someone who is really, really bad off, there's virtually no hope for them, and all of a sudden they miraculously recover? That's the power of prayer. It has to be. In the way that doctors can't explain it, nobody can understand it. So we have to make sure that we're persistent in our prayers to God. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says that if we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So we have to make sure that, again, as Christians, as faithful Christians, we continuously pray to God and that we never give up in those prayers. Again, this is one of the main points that Jesus was giving to his disciples here as he was telling this parable. And for them to not get discouraged. We don't need to get discouraged when we pray to God and we don't see the results that we're looking for. Or maybe we don't see those results immediately. Understanding that God answers those prayers in his own time and he answers those in his own way. Maybe the answer to that prayer is that person that we're praying for, it's just their time to go. Maybe that means it's their time to be with God in heaven. Maybe they've done all they need to here on this earth and God has decided this is the right time. Or maybe there's some other reason. But having faith and understanding that God has a purpose for everything, it doesn't mean that we stop trying. Again, we have to make sure that we are persistent in our prayer to God and never giving up. The second point that I want to look at tonight is that we're persistent in our teaching. When we teach others, it can often get discouraging, especially in certain situations, but make sure that we never give up in regards to our teaching to others. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 says, "But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, but with gentleness and respect." Always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you. We have to make sure that we are prepared when someone asks us tough questions. We talked about this morning about being prepared, about the right training is important if we expect to get to heaven. And that means reading and understanding and knowing the Bible. And we're not always going to understand everything. I think that everyone's going to leave this earth not having an understanding about certain parts of the Bible. I think that God designed that. So we can't possibly know everything, but we can be prepared to answer a lot of these tough questions. The main ones I'm thinking about are salvation. What do we have to do to go to heaven? Well, the Bible is very clear on that. What about in regards to Christianity in today's society? Again, as we're studying that on Wednesday nights, the Bible is very clear on that. What about the old law versus the new law? We see people today looking at the Jewish nation as our brothers because there is a background there in regards to God. The Old Testament is about the Jews. Again, the New Testament is very clear on that. And that those that don't accept Jesus are an abomination to him. They reject him. Those are not our brothers. And so again, the Bible is very clear on a lot of the conversations that we have in today's terms, especially when it comes to salvation. There is no stone left unturned when it comes to teaching about salvation and what God expects of us. And so we have to make sure that we're prepared in those situations. I find a whole lot more respect for someone who is prepared and gives a good, reasonable defense for a tough question than for somebody who seems to have all the answers and he goes, I don't know. Or maybe they throw out some kind of answer that they can tell us fake. And maybe I don't always have the answer, but I'm going to make sure that I find the answer. So I have to make sure that we study to learn to understand so we can answer those questions when we are teaching. Next, we have to look at James chapter 5, verse 19 says, "My brothers and sisters, if anyone among you strays from the truth, and someone turns him back, let him know that the one who has turned the sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and cover a multitude of sins." So just as we are supposed to be prepared and be persistent, not get discouraged in our teaching when it comes to the tough questions, we also have to make sure that we teach those and help those who have maybe gone the wrong direction. If someone strays from the truth, if someone turns him back, it means our teaching is not always to someone who is an unbeliever. It's not always to someone who is an atheist or worships some other religion. Sometimes our teaching is to someone who has been a faithful Christian before but has fallen away, and they need further teaching and guidance to bring them back. We have to make sure that we're persistent in that. You ever know someone who has fallen away from the church? Got to make sure they're persistent in that. I tell you because I've been one of those people. And because people didn't give up on me, that's the reason I'm here today. And that's why it's important that we don't just count somebody out. And that there's always a hope and always a chance. The next passage that we see here is Matthew chapter 10, verse 14 says, "And whoever does not receive you nor listen to your words, as you leave that house or city, shake the dust off your feet. Truly I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that city." Speaking to others about the Bible can get very frustrating. There have been times where I've been very frustrated because the answer is clear, it's right here, and whoever we're talking to just doesn't want to see it. Or maybe it's something very simple that you should know and understand, and here it is, and you just don't understand or reject it or whatever it is. Those times will get very frustrating. I've had friends I've talked to try to convert them, and again, I've shown them the way, and they just reject it for one reason or another because it's not what they want to hear. That can get very frustrating. But again, we have to be persistent. The question is, how persistent do we need to be? Well, until we've given it everything that we got. And that's the guidance that Jesus gives us right here. He says, whoever does not receive you nor listen to your words, as you leave that house or city, shake the dust off your feet. You see, if we're doing everything that we can to help others, again, never giving up if at all possible, but maybe it gets to a point to where they just flat out rejected you and everything that you said and done. Again, I've been a part of that within the last year or so. I've said this many times that I had a friend who I was talking to, and I thought for a while I was making a lot of progress, and all of a sudden came down one night where he wanted an answer that I could not give. He wanted a simple answer of doing this and you're going to go to heaven, and I couldn't give him that answer. And he shot back pretty hard. That was a very frustrating thing. At that point, I said, you know what? I've done everything I possibly can. If you ever want to come back, I'm right here. But this conversation's over. Because of how it went. I felt like I'd done everything I possibly could. He was refusing and rejecting everything I was throwing at him because he had one thing set on his mind. And when I couldn't give him that answer, he was done. I think that there does become a point to where we have to make sure that we don't get too down on ourselves and don't get too discouraged when those times come. Because some people are just going to reject God no matter what. Some people are just going to reject Jesus no matter what. A few days later, that guy came coming back. More questions. I was more than willing to open up and answer those questions and to talk and study with them again. But again, sometimes you get to the point where that conversation ends because you've done everything you can, and they just don't accept it, and then that's just the way it is. Some people just will not see the truth. They don't want to hear the truth. And when that happens, again, Jesus says it'll be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that city or for that person. I think about the times where maybe I'm shaking the dust off my feet. And I ask myself in those times, did I give it everything I could? Did I try my best? Was there something else I could have done differently? Or was it I put in everything I needed to and they just rejected it? I think it's important that Jesus told his disciples this phrase here. And that when we hear the word of God, we either have to accept it or we reject it. And if we reject what we're told, then we're rejecting Jesus. We're rejecting God. And if we're shown the truth and yet reject the truth, then we're looking at a harsh punishment. And for those of us who teach and try to turn others, if they're shown the truth and don't do it, we have to shake the dust off our feet. And sometimes that can get very discouraging. I told you guys a story probably about 15, 16 years ago. There's a guy that I work with, and he came from a very, very rough background. And he worked with me. I was taking him back and forth to work. He made a lot of bad decisions in his life. He also had a very rough background in his life. And we started studying during break one night. He came to church with me a few times. And I thought that maybe this was an open door for maybe this person who had a very rough lifestyle to find a way to God. He seemed to be very open and willing to listen to the Bible. And again, all of a sudden, one day he was gone. He had his mind made up as to what he wanted to do with his life, and that was it. Sometimes, again, our teaching doesn't go the way that we want to. But again, doesn't mean that we give up entirely. And again, always leave that door open. I think always leave that door open just in case they come back. And then the third point here that we have for tonight is that we are persistent in our faith. We have to be persistent in regards to our faith to God. 1 John chapter 5, verse 3 says, "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. For whoever has been born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith." You've ever found yourself where your faith is shaken? Maybe it's a situation that you've gone through. Maybe you've seen other people go through tough times, but your faith is shaken. Maybe it's because you're just doubting something in your life. Maybe it's because of your own mistakes. But it's very easy to get down in our faith, again, if we're not aware. Again, we know that if we keep God's commandments, it says that his commandments are not burdensome. You see, God doesn't give us a system here to where it's so hard to get to heaven that it can't be possible. God's given us everything that we need in regards to what we have to do. He's given us a perfect blueprint as to what we need to do to go to heaven. So when we get down our faith, knowing that God's given us everything that we need, it is possible. And knowing that God has defeated the world, that Jesus has defeated the world, and that if we keep our faith in him, we can do the same thing. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, James says, "Consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect results, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." James says that when you go through various trials, you should look at this as an opportunity. Don't get down and say, why is this happening to me? But look at this and say, this is a chance for me to grow, a chance for me to get better, a chance for me to get stronger. It's a very interesting point of view here. And that when our backs are against the wall, when our faith is against the wall, when we feel like we're being tested so hard spiritually, and that's not to pull us down, but it's an opportunity for us to get stronger and to get closer to God. And that by succeeding through this situation, by relying on God and relying on Jesus through this situation, by relying on the Bible and doing what God tells me to, it makes me stronger. You ever know somebody to where you think that they're just so strong spiritually that nothing would ever shake them? I look around across this auditorium and I see a lot of those people. That doesn't come by chance. It doesn't come just overnight. It comes from going through situation after situation. It comes from every time that you're in a bad place, that faith pushes through. And that perseverance leads to strength. And eventually that strength gets so strong that Satan can try, but it doesn't break through. See, that's what being persistent does to us. That's what that perseverance does to us. And that when we push through, it makes us stronger. And the stronger we are, the harder that Satan is going to have in getting us on his side. And then finally, John 16:33 says, "These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world." And maybe that verse there is one of the most comforting that we see in the entire Bible, in that Jesus has overcome the world. Think about what Jesus went through during his life here on this earth. You know, Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. He calls himself the Son of Man. But Jesus went through every human emotion and feeling that we do. He went through starvation. We look at his time in 40 days and nights in the wilderness, and Satan trying to tempt Jesus. We see Jesus, the man, being crucified and beaten and tortured and bleeding out and finally taking his last breath. Jesus was mocked. He was run out of towns. He was literally put to death. How did Jesus overcome the world? They killed him. So how did Jesus overcome the world? Because he came back. When Jesus was resurrected, not only did he defeat death, but he defeated Satan and every single power on this earth. And that even though Jesus came in human form and felt all the same things that we do, Jesus was not as weak as we are. And when Jesus was crucified and resurrected, he became more powerful than any of us could ever imagine. He defeated Satan the second that he took his last breath and the second that he rose from the dead. See, Satan can't defeat Jesus. Satan can't defeat God. The devil's tried to many, many times over thousands of years, but it's not possible. A few months ago, we went through a book, or was it not, a class talking about angels and created beings, spiritual beings. And we talked in depth about this very topic, about how Satan, through one way or another, was created by God for one reason or another. And that Satan does what he does because God allows him to. See, God has complete power over everything. And Jesus has that power too. So for us as Christians, knowing that Jesus went through all that here on earth, and that if we're faithful to God, faithful to Jesus, they're on our side, they've defeated everything that could ever come to this earth. There's no ruler, there's no dictator, there's no politician or actor. They're more powerful than all of them. And so if our faith stays in God, and if our faith stays in Jesus, then we too can overcome this world. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to go through difficult times. It doesn't mean that we're going to have times to where maybe we feel like we can't go any further. But having faith that Jesus went through all this, God has put me here, God provided a path, and that nothing I will go through can ever be so tough that if I rely on Him, I can't make it through. You see, our faith has got to get stronger as we go through those times and not weak. We have to be persistent in our faith. We have to persevere through the hard times. And in doing that, we have to be like that widow, in that she kept going back and time again until finally that judge gave in. And I will go back to that as we begin to close up tonight. Going back to our original passage, verse 6 of Luke chapter 18, the Lord said, "Listen to what the unrighteous judge said. Now will God not bring about justice for His elect and cry out again day and night? And will He delay long for them? I tell you that He will bring about justice for them quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will He find faith on the earth?" And that's what it comes down to, is our faith and our persistence, our perseverance in relying on God and Jesus being faithful to them. And that we can't give up. We have to be persistent to the point where Satan just gives up. I think about the story of Job. And that Satan was looking to find somebody, and God said, "Have you considered my servant Job?" He said, "Do whatever you need to, just don't harm him." And so He took everything from Job, his children, his livestock, his livelihood. Job never broke. He goes back again. This time, Job, his health status got in pretty bad shape. God said, "Don't kill him." Job went through a lot of hard times. And even his wife said, "Are you going to turn your back on that God now?" And Job didn't. Not at that point in time. So he went through all these things. Everything was taken from him, but yet he was persistent in staying faithful to God. See, when we do that time and time again, Satan begins to lose hope that he could ever get to us. And if Satan loses hope that he can get to us, it means that we're that much closer to God and that much closer to heaven. Satan will never stop trying. We got to make it very, very difficult for him. And that we have to be persistent. We cannot get discouraged when we go through these times or when we don't get the results that we're looking for. Because again, we see what Jesus went through. We see what Peter went through. We see what Stephen went through. And so many others that we read about in the Bible. They went through a lot of hard times, a lot of difficult things. Some of these men were even put to death. So we have to make sure that when it seems like times get tough, that we have to push through it as well. We have to be persistent in regards to our faith. And be persistent in regards to doing the will of God, even when it feels like we're just spinning our wheels. We have to keep at it. Because at some point in time, those wheels are going to gain traction. And we're going to get movement. And whether it is our own lives or whether it is impacting somebody else, we've got to keep going further. Like I said this morning, we got to keep pushing towards that finish line. We got to keep pushing towards that goal. And that we never stop pushing towards that. And if we get discouraged to the point to where we stop, then heaven gets further and further away. I think of a story from about 2 months ago, well, actually several months ago. And I have a runner to where she's had some health issues the last couple of years. She's a senior this year. And she's had some bad hip issues to where she's finished races and basically couldn't even walk. And right around halfway point of the season, back this past fall, she said, "I want to try to run in college." I said, "Okay." Times weren't great, but we'll try it. And she wanted to try Calhoun. And so she emailed the coach. Never heard back. She came to me and said, "He hasn't written back. What do I do?" I said, "Give it a few days." I said, they're in nationals. Give it a few days. And after a couple of weeks, never wrote back. She said, "What do I do now?" I said, "Email him again." I said, "Do it again." I said, "I'll email him as well, but keep at it." And eventually, he brought her in, interviewed her, and agreed to have a spot for her next year. And I talked to that coach about 3 weeks ago at her college signing, which I found out just before that they offered her a free ride. And I talked to their coach, and he said the reason that I brought her on was because she didn't stop. First email was bad timing. I was not all that she said, but she didn't stop. And he said she's that determined that she's got to be a hard worker, and it's got to be somebody that I want on my team. And her persistence paid off. And she did something that probably a year ago she didn't even think was possible. That's exactly how our faith in God works. When something doesn't seem possible, we'll keep pushing on and pushing on and pushing on. And eventually, it's going to get there. And even when it feels like our time on this earth is a struggle and like we're not going anywhere, eventually that persistence is going to pay off. So tonight, as we close the lesson, if there's anyone here who needs some help getting your wheels going back again, if there's anyone here tonight who has been discouraged in your faith to God, or maybe discouraged in regards to teaching others, or just discouraged spiritually at all, this is the chance to get it right, whether you need to come forward and get something that you've done, or to get prayers from the church to help you get through a certain situation, or maybe it's just a mental reset. To say, it's going to be okay, I got to keep pushing through. It's not going to be easy, but man, will it pay off if I get to heaven. So if we can help anyone tonight anyway, please come as we stand and as we sing. Out of my body.